Hi, my name is Detrick DeBurr, and I'm a technical consultant here at Broadcom. Over the next 20 minutes or so, I'd like to talk to you about Cobol, the next generation of Cobol developers, what I expect, and more importantly, what I expect to see and how I think we should prepare as Cobol developers and mainframers in general over the next 10 years. I guess a great place to start is just to talk about Cobol today and where are we today. So I'll talk a little bit about the development community, what that looks like. We'll talk about, what kind of code is out there and how much is out there and who really uses it and what for, because that at the end of the day is really going to dictate the lasting effect of Cobol and who will really and how strong it'll really be. So a good place to start, I guess, is just like I said, to talk about the community. And the community of Cobolers can be divided into two groups. One being those current, what we call legacy developers. And about 50% of those currently are people who are reaching retirement age. And that's a huge issue for many organizations, obviously. However, there's also what I consider to be this other group of what I'll call the modern developers who want to interact and engage with Cobol, but they're what I call barriers to entry. Many of these barriers to entry are simply things, like education and it's being a little bit more difficult to get your hands on, mainframe resources, for example. It's not like you can just go out and download tools or something. So the barriers to entry are a little bit difficult. So what are some things we can do about that? What's the response for that? But first of all, let me answer that first question just so we can get a healthy understanding for the lay of the land. Right now, when you think about how much code is actually out there, Cobol code that's actually out there, it's a lot. We're talking about over 200 billion lines of code and growing. Most of that is active, 65%, some people say. And here's the key, and this is what's important. It is about 70% of critical business logic in that Cobol code. So it's not going anywhere. It's being used. It's functioning. So that leads me to the question of, well, who's actually using it? Well, what you have is Fortune 500 companies. As a matter of fact, over 90% of them actually are actively using Cobol programming language. If we think about it, it's the common business oriented language. That's what it is. And the reason that they do this, it makes perfect sense. These companies have been around as long as they have because they are profitable. They have been able to bring in steady revenues, but more importantly, they've been able to keep the cost under control. And Cobol is great for that. The cost, once developed, the cost of maintaining and keeping Cobol code alive and functioning is relatively low compared to some of the other languages that may be out there. So because of that, there's really no economic driver to say, hey, let's go make this shift and make this change. So that's why organizations just tend to hang on to it. Now, with that said, okay, we now know that there's some barriers to entry and we know that, well, companies are using it. What does that mean for us going forward? Okay, what does that mean in the next generation? And I want to talk about how I think the universities are responding, and this speaks to specifically to what I was referring to was barriers to entry. And then I also think it's important to take a look at what the tech companies are doing, because that's huge. And then lastly, I want to very quickly touch on Cobol 2014, which is sort of what's considered the end of life version of Cobol. Well, for starters, the university response has been basically that they have decided to teach fewer and fewer Cobol classes. And now, if you think about this, that's really not that bad, because whereas many of the people who are Cobol developers today, it wasn't even considered computer science, it was data processing, right? And it was a part of maybe the accounting department, or it was a part of the math department. And then it was only a little bit later, probably in the late 80s, early 90s, where they really started to focus on just computer science. And so many of the computer science programs are not necessarily teaching Cobol as a required language, but they're leaving it out there as an elective. So it is possible. Now, with that said, this is one of those blessings and curses where these universities have kind of fallen off. What has happened is some of the flexible learning resources that are out there have actually picked up the slack, like Coursera, for example, which is basically free, where you can take different courses. There are sites out there like Pluralsight and Udemy that actually will take up some of the slack, so to speak, of what the universities are not doing. And so there are ways to bridge that barrier to entry. With that said, the developer has to take a little bit of initiative in that. And we'll talk about that toward the end when I speak specifically to how we best prepare for this. What about the tech response, though? Well, tech companies, I think we could sum it up best as adapt and adjust. Many of the companies now have adapted or adapted to this whole idea of open source and what I'll call just openness in general. Whereas 15 years ago, that was not necessarily the case, where things were a little bit more proprietary. Today, being open is perfectly fine, but they really hearkened on this idea of modernization as it relates to the mainframe in particular and Cobol in general, or vice versa, Cobol in particular and the mainframe in general. And then one of the things that I really think has made the mainframe environment and the Cobol in itself a lot more attractive is just common tooling. And so that is how the tech industry has responded. Now, there's this thing called Cobol 2014, and I think it's important to just stick this in here just a second. Cobol 2014 was the last iteration or version or standard of Cobol. And what Cobol has always brought to the table is this thing called backwards compatibility, meaning that whatever you wrote before works just fine, even if you were to move to newer versions of Cobol and, and make different types of upgrades. And that made it over time very, very cost efficient. And so I say that to say that despite the fact that it was able to take on some of what I'll call modern language features, it actually was able to stay pretty much backwards compatible. Now, there were some things that are now obsolete that were just pretty much no longer being used for all practical purposes, though. Classic Cobol, the benefits of classic Cobol are still there, and that's huge. And so with that said, now this is considered to be the end of life version. So what that means is now there won't be a whole lot of what I'll call new learning around the language. And so now people can get really deep in understanding it. With that said, it brings to Cobol, and this is actually in Cobol 2000, but in 2014, they speak specifically to the idea of things like object-oriented, for example, and things like method overloading. Those are things that computer science graduates are really, really accustomed to, and things they're expected, and things they look for in the languages that they like the C and the C# and the other languages that are out there. Now, so with that said, the future, what does the future look like? Well, I think we have to look at this three different ways. We have to look at it, first of all, we're going to look at the idea, or embrace the idea, rather, that the future of Cobol is openness. I made reference to the idea of modernization. I made reference to the idea of open source, and, for example, the Open Mainframe Project in particular. Openness is extremely important. I also want to talk a little bit about the signs and the signals. These are those key events that have happened over the last few years that are really going to impact how we see Cobol and the mainframe going forward. And then what are some of just the general trends that are out there in the world of just computing in general that I think we need to kind of sort of navigate. And then once we take a look at those things, then I will touch on the 4 or 5 things that I think we need to really embrace as we move forward. That being said, the first one, the future is open. What does that mean? That means we're embracing modern tooling. That means we're the idea of modernization and bringing into the mainframe world a lot of the approaches to software development that are very, very attractive and have been proven to work outside of the mainframe world. We definitely want to bring them into the mainframe world, and we're calling that modernization. There's also Amazon Web Services, which they have just are really, really moving to start to treat the mainframe just like another cloud platform. And I really like that idea. And I'm thinking about tools, for example, like Jana Studio, which takes COBOL code and converts it. And the interesting idea there is that I think that we won't be doing wholesale conversions of COBOL to Java, because sometimes it just doesn't make any sense. Keep in mind that COBOL is very, very good at what it does. And so it's very, very readable. And so it's important that there is an aspect of the COBOL that is readable and accessible to the business side. And then also there are some things that we can take advantage of with some of the other languages, like Java, for example, where need be. And so something like a Jana Studio allows us to do those conversions, not necessarily wholesale, but piecemeal. And what that means is, though, although you may be looking to do a what I'll call COBOL conversion, you probably won't be converting the entire program, just key pieces of it or key components of it, which means that you have to ultimately understand the COBOL aspect of it inside of the side of it in the first place, to decide what could be done better outside of COBOL and what's best left inside of COBOL. So I think that's huge. And that's going to be a huge opportunity for COBOL developers going forward. So what are some of the trends that we see out there? Well, I think probably one of the biggest ones is that we're moving from the physical, meaning these large, big data centers, to what I'm calling the metaphysical, basically, i.e. like the cloud, for example. And so going back to Amazon Web Services, there is a huge push and shift to make the footprint of the data centers considerably smaller. And that makes perfect sense. And ultimately getting to a point where we can treat the mainframe itself just like another platform. And we'll talk a little bit about, say, for example, Zoe, which does just that. But another aspect of this or that is the concept of DevOps, whereas with many of the off-host development platforms, development languages, there's this idea of very rapid development and very rapid deployment. As a matter of fact, so rapid that it's continuous integration and continuous deployment. And so we basically have turned software development into an assembly line type of process on this side. And so what's going to end up happening is that the mainframe and COBOL in particular is what I'm talking about. We're going to have to begin to embrace some of those type of strategies, DevOps strategies. And then another driver, which I think is huge, is going to be the metaverse. Now, there's a lot of discussion about what it means and what it doesn't mean, but here's what we do know. It's going to require a lot of computing power. And to date, the best way to generate a lot of computing power is still with the mainframe. So I don't think the mainframe will go anywhere. We have to make some adjustments here and there. Like I said, adapt and adjust. But for the most part, what we will really be talking about doing is shifting how we use the mainframe in general, in particular, COBOL. So what are some of the signals and the signs that I saw that I thought was really, really interesting? First of all, Google purchased Cornerstone, which I thought was interesting, which is a consultancy whose purpose or their mission is mainframe modernization. And that may mean, translation projects where it makes sense. That also may mean moving certain things to the cloud, but very seldom does it mean a wholesale ripping out of the mainframe. Very seldom does it mean a wholesale rewrite of a COBOL program. And so Google making that type of investment in a company like Cornerstone is a telltale sign that they see this future and they want to be poised to see how they can best help in this overall modernization. Now, it's interesting that I mentioned Google because Amazon, right around the same time, launched its mainframe modernization initiative, which means that it recognizes also that the mainframe isn't going anywhere. So what we're really talking about doing is how do we modernize, how do we retrofit this platform, number one, and this programming language, number two, to fit to the modern day and times. And then lastly, like I said, one of the main signals or the events was once COBOL embraced things like the object orientation and overloading, that's when I think it'll be appreciated, is a good way to say it, by computer science graduates. And they'll say, okay, the things that I can do in my Java, the things I can do in my C#, the things I can do in my other object-oriented languages, I can do them in Cobol too. Wow, that's great. So with that said, with those trends and those signals, those events, I mean, how do we actually prepare? You know, what do I see us needing to do? Well, just like the companies before, I said, adjusting and adapting is a great way to put it. Adjusting and adapting. The first recommendation that I have is that as a Cobol developer, Cobol is not going anywhere, and that skill will be valuable. But it's also going to be very, very important to embrace some other modern language. Many mainframers are familiar with Rex, or maybe Python, or some other language, or JavaScript, or some other language, but it's going to be important to embrace a modern language. I think that's important because what we're going to begin to see is that there won't be just a Cobol program, there'll be applications. And so this Cobol code may be interacting with other languages. So it'll be very, very important that although we have a great grasp on Cobol, we also need a pretty solid grasp on some other language too. And that could be any language of choice. Ideally, a scripting language like a Python or JavaScript is perfectly fine. But embracing one of the more modern languages is definitely one of the things we want to do. Another thing that we definitely want to do is we want to embrace open source. Now, I know like a few 10 or 15 years ago, that was not the move for many large organizations, but open source and an open approach to things, I think is going to be the future, i.e. Zoe, for example, and I mentioned it in a second, embracing Zoe, but just embracing the idea of people all over the world contributing to code bases in an open way will be the future, and that's how things will be built. And just embracing that idea, which is very, very different from how we've done things in the past. And then another things that we definitely need to embrace is what I'll call the modern IDE. And in essence, what that means is moving to a Visual Studio Code, ideally, or maybe Eclipse or Eclipse Shade or something like that, but moving away from the green screen as our primary interface with the mainframe is probably going to be one of those things that I know many mainframers are going to have an issue with. But one of the advantages of that is that many of these modern IDEs, and I'll just use Visual Studio Code as an example, allows us to go from language to language to language to language without having to relearn a tool. And I'll go back to another thing that I really think is important that we're going to need to embrace is Zoe. Zoe is basically a set of tools that will allow us to engage and interact with the mainframe and treat it just like any other cloud platform. And so that basically will open up the mainframe world to quote unquote a non-mainframe developer or Cobol developer in this particular case. And then the last thing, which I think may surprise some people, is I think we're going to have to embrace pair programming. And pair programming is basically where you have two developers working on an application on a set of code. And the reason I bring that up is because one of the issues, if you remember me making reference to the developer community, is that mainframe developers or legacy developers and Cobol developers in particular are maturing. So it'll be really, really good to get a more mature developer to actually sit with, literally, a person who's not as familiar with Cobol code, but is very, very familiar with modern languages, and them actually doing that programming together, because that's where the knowledge transfer is going to ultimately come. And that's how organizations are going to be able to capture and hang on to basically this asset that they have that may be retiring in a few years. So those are some of the things that I think we are going to need to do to prepare. With that said, I don't think Cobol is going anywhere. It's fundamentally sound in that it was written for business applications. Businesses still use those applications, and there is no foreseeable reason to change that. because at the end of the day, they work and they work just fine, and they work at a reasonably low cost. And so what I'm expecting us to do, ultimately, this will be over the next 8 to 10 years, a really big case of adaptation and adjustment. Anyway, with that said, thank you very much and happy Coboling.